Eliza Whitmore gripped the worn leather strap of her bag, her knuckles bone white. The wind at Summit Ridge Station wasn't just cold, it was a knife. It sliced through her coat, whipped her skirts, and screamed in her ears. Behind her, the train hissed its final goodbye, clanging away into the fog, leaving her utterly alone. She had a name, Thomas Bellamy, and a promise that was starting to feel like a ghost. She scanned the empty platform. No wagon, no man with a kind face, just a stray dog and a station master who couldn't care less. She pulled the letter from her pocket. The paper was creased, smudged, and she knew every word by heart. Come to Summit Ridge. I have a house, a farm, and 7 children who need a mother. I'll be there when you step off the train. TB. 3 days she'd traveled. 3 days on a hard bench, trading her last piece of jewelry for help with her trunks. All for this. For nothing. Then a boy appeared at the end of the platform. He was pale, shoeless, and staring at her like she was something that had crawled out of a grave. She forced a smile. "Are you Eliza Whitmore?" he asked. His voice was flat, empty. "Yes." He didn't smile back. "He's married now," the boy said. "Got hitched 2 weeks ago." The world stopped. The wind died. The only sound was the frantic pounding in her own ears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was apologizing to. The boy just shrugged, like he delivered bad news for a living. "Pa said you wouldn't come. Everyone told him you wouldn't. Then he met Martha. She had land. You didn't." It was that simple, that brutal. Land. He'd traded her for a piece of dirt. "He's married," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The boy nodded. "I'm Eli, his 3rd oldest. He told us to wait, just in case." A gust of wind nearly tore the hat from her head. She turned away, hiding the shame that burned her cheeks. All this way for public humiliation. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice dangerously steady. "Up the hill. Cabins are 2 miles that way." He pointed into the thick, dark woods. "You don't have to go. I can tell him you came and left." "No." The word came out sharp, like chipped flint. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was solid iron. "I'll go." Eli looked at her. Really looked at her this time, and a flicker of something, maybe respect, crossed his face. "You sure?" "I didn't come this far to be turned away on a train platform." He thought about it for a second, then gave a short, sharp nod. He grabbed her heavy bag like it weighed nothing. "This way," he said, and led her toward a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. The path was frozen, slick with ice and bordered by thorns. Each step was a struggle, a fight against the cold and the crushing weight in her chest. Every foot forward took her further from the life she'd torched behind her and closer to a man who had already thrown her away. The Bellamy homestead wasn't a home. It was a wound on the side of the hill, a sagging gray shack that looked like it was tired of standing. A crooked finger of smoke curled from the chimney. The whole place leaned, like a strong wind would send it tumbling down into the valley. Eli set her bag down on the porch. "You should know," he said, his voice dropping low. "Martha, she don't like visitors." Before she could ask, the door creaked open. And there he was, Thomas Bellamy. He was taller than his letters suggested, broader, but his face was a wreck. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade, haunted by ghosts of his own making. The color drained from his face when he saw her. "Eliza," he breathed. She said nothing. She just stood there, a statue carved from ice and fury, waiting. Then a woman appeared behind him. Martha. She was sharp and wiry like a wildflower that grew in rocky soil. Her hands were on her hips, her eyes narrowed to slits. "You must be the letter girl," she spat. Thomas flinched. "Martha, please." "She should go," Martha snapped, her voice cracking like dry twigs. "You swore she wouldn't come." "You lied," Eliza said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the icy air like a razor. Thomas looked from one woman to the other, trapped. "I didn't lie," he mumbled. I didn't think—" "You didn't think I'd sell everything I owned based on your promise?" Eliza's words were stones, and she threw each one with perfect aim. "You said they needed a mother." "She needs to leave," Martha said again, stepping in front of Thomas, trying to block Eliza's view, trying to own the space. "Before the other children see her." "They already saw," a voice said. It was Eli, still standing on the steps. "We all did." Martha whirled on him. "Get back inside!" But Eli didn't move. He looked straight at Eliza, his eyes dark and serious. "We read your letters," he said, his voice low and clear. "Pa kept them in a box. I read 'em to the little ones, so they'd know what a mother sounded like." Tears burned the back of Eliza's eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't here for pity. She was here for an accounting. "You wrote me," she said, her gaze locking on to Thomas. "You begged me to come." "I know," he whispered, his eyes on the ground. "But I couldn't wait forever. It had been weeks." "I was gathering the money," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she didn't know she possessed. "I was selling my life to come here and build a new one with you." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped. The trees held their breath. "I'll go," Eliza said finally, lifting her chin. "But not because she told me to. I'll go because a liar's house is no place for an honest woman." She turned to walk away, to march back down that frozen path and disappear. But Eli's voice stopped her. "You could stay by the creek," he said. Everyone froze. "There's a flat place near the big rocks. You could build a fire." Martha's jaw dropped. "Absolutely not. Thomas, tell her." But Thomas said nothing. He just stood there, a hollow man on a broken-down porch. Eliza looked at Eli, at his bare feet, his tattered coat, his steady, unwavering gaze. He wasn't begging, he was offering. He was a boy who still believed in the promises his father had written, even if the man himself had forgotten them. And in that moment, she knew. This story wasn't over. It hadn't ended at the train station. It was just beginning. Right here, on the edge of nothing, with a boy who believed in letters. "Show me where," she said. Eli led her down a different path, away from the sagging house and the ghosts on its porch. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground. As they disappeared into the trees, Martha slammed the cabin door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. But Eliza didn't look back. The creek was a silver ribbon winding through birch trees, its water murmuring over stones. Eli pointed to a small, flat clearing sheltered by a cluster of tall pines. "Here," he said. It wasn't much, just a patch of frosty grass and a few large rocks. There was no roof, no walls, no comfort. There was only the bone-deep quiet of being completely, utterly alone. Eli left her with a thin blanket, a dented kettle, and a small sack of matches he'd pulled from his pocket. He didn't say goodbye. He just gave her a quick, solemn nod and vanished back into the woods, a small soldier returning to enemy territory. She worked quickly, her hands numb with cold, but her mind sharp. The small canvas tent she'd brought from Boston was meant for summer nights, not the brutal teeth of a mountain winter, but it would have to do. She stretched it between two trees, weighed down the corners with her trunk, and piled pine needles inside to create a nest. It was pathetic. It was a shelter of last resort, but it was hers. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, she caught the scent of wood smoke from the Bellamy cabin. It wasn't anger she felt. Not yet. It was a weariness so profound it settled in her bones. She pulled out Thomas's first letter, the paper soft as cloth from being read so many times. "Eliza, I don't need much. Just someone who will sit at the table and stay. There's 7 of them now. The youngest cries at night. The oldest thinks he's grown. We need someone who will come for more than a name. Well, she had come, and she was still here. Night fell like a hammer, and the temperature plummeted. She built a small, sputtering fire and boiled creek water for mint tea. Dinner was a single hard biscuit and the bitter taste of memory. She was huddled in her makeshift nest, arms wrapped around her knees when she heard it. A soft crunching of leaves. Not one set of feet, but several. Cautious, hesitant. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A small voice whispered from the edge of the clearing. "Miss Eliza?" She turned. 3 children stood in the shadows, their faces pale in the firelight. It was Eli, and with him, 2 little girls, bundled in thin shawls, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. "I didn't bring them," Eli said quickly, defensively. "They followed me." The smallest girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, took a tentative step forward. "Are you the letter lady?" she asked, her voice a tiny bird's chirp. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. She could only nod. "I suppose I am." The older girl, maybe 9, held out a crumpled piece of paper. "We brought you a story," she said. "That's what you do, right? You tell stories." Eliza took the paper. It was smudged with dirt, a child's clumsy scrawl covering the page. "Once there was a mama who lived in the letters, and we missed her even before she came." The words hit her harder than Martha's insults, harder than Thomas's betrayal. She couldn't speak. She just opened the flap of her tent and waved them inside. They scurried in without a word, huddling together for warmth. Eli stood guard at the entrance, his eyes scanning the dark woods, a boy far too young for the burdens he carried. Eliza coaxed the fire a little higher and broke her last biscuit into 4 small pieces. "Eat slow," she whispered. The girls nibbled the crumbs like starving mice, their eyes wide and grateful. Eli waited until they were finished before taking his piece. "They'll notice we're gone," he said, his voice low, "if they look." "Do they usually?" Eliza asked. Eli just shook his head, and that simple gesture told her everything she needed to know about the house on the hill. When the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Eliza opened her trunk. She pulled out a bundle wrapped in blue cloth. Inside were the letters, all of them, every word Thomas had ever sent her. She chose one at random. "This one," she said, her voice soft in the quiet tent, "is about the spring calf. He said he called it Buttons, because its spots were as round as the buttons on a coat. He said it followed the littlest one, June, around like a shadow." The smallest girl, June, broke into a tiny, hesitant smile. Eliza read, her voice steady and calm. She didn't add drama or flair. She just let the words breathe, and the children seemed to breathe with them, their small shoulders relaxing for the first time. When she finished, a comfortable silence settled over them. A night bird called from deep in the woods. Finally, Eli stood up. "We should go." "Tomorrow?" June asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eliza nodded. "Tomorrow." They slipped away as quietly as they had come. Eliza watched until their small shapes were swallowed by the darkness. When she turned back to her tent, she saw it. Lined up neatly outside the flap were 3 pairs of small, worn-out shoes. They weren't forgotten. They were placed. A promise. The next morning, the shoes were gone. But that night, they returned. This time, a 4th child came with them. A boy a little older than June, and they brought a chipped tin mug filled with lukewarm milk, likely stolen. They listened longer this time. June brought a doll with a missing eye and asked if the letter mama knew how to sew. Eliza said yes, and she meant it. The visits became a ritual, a secret church held in the cold dark. She never asked them about Martha or how they managed to slip away. She just made sure the fire was warm and there was always a story waiting. And every single night, without fail, the shoes would be lined up outside her tent when they left. A silent testament. She was stitching a new button eye on June's doll when she realized something. She had come here for a husband, for a home. But that wasn't what she'd found. She'd found these children. Or maybe they had found her. She started writing again, not to anyone back east, but to herself. "Dear Eliza," she wrote by the flickering firelight, "you may have come to marry a man, but you stayed to meet his children. Maybe that's worth more." She folded the note and tucked it into a makeshift mailbox she'd nailed to a nearby tree. A silly, hopeful gesture. The town hadn't noticed her yet. Martha hadn't come storming down the hill, but something was shifting. The mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And Eliza waited too, no longer for a man, but for the sound of small, secret footsteps in the dark. The first snow fell without a sound, a fine white dust that settled over the hills like a shroud. Eliza woke to a world of white, a sharp, biting stillness in the air. The children hadn't come the night before. She told herself it was the weather, that they were being watched too closely. But a cold knot of fear tightened in her gut. She stirred the ashes of her fire, coaxing a small flame back to life. As the warmth spread, so did the unease. This life she was building was as fragile as a spider's web, and the first winter storm could tear it all apart. Around midday, she heard a rustling in the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was Eli, his cheeks red from the cold, dragging something heavy wrapped in burlap. He collapsed by the fire, breathless. It was a small wooden box, crudely nailed shut. "Found it," he gasped, his voice low and urgent. "In the barn. Pa's old letterbox. The one he kept my letters in." Eli shook his head, his eyes dark. "No, the one he used before. The one he kept everything in." Eliza ran a gloved hand over the rough wood. "Why bring it here, Eli?" The boy's jaw was tight. He looked like he was chewing on broken glass. "Because she tried to burn it." Eliza's blood ran cold. She pried the lid open. Inside was a mess of scorched paper, scraps of letters, some whole, most burned at the edges. But the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Thomas Bellamy's. There were phrases she recognized, and others she'd never seen before. Lines he must have written but never had the courage to send. She carried the box to the fire as the other children began to appear, drawn by some unspoken signal. They gathered around her, their faces solemn. June helped her sort the blackened fragments, fitting them together like a heartbreaking puzzle. Hours passed. The snow fell harder. Using red thread from her sewing kit and a crude glue made from pine resin, they stitched the letters back together. They were a patchwork of hope and regret. "If she never comes," one read, "I'll still read these out loud so they know what it means to wait for kindness." Another said, "Tell Eliza the baby laughs when he hears her name." That must mean something. And the last one they pieced together, the most devastating of all. "I don't know how to be enough for them. But maybe she can be. Maybe her heart's big enough to cover what mine couldn't." Eliza read each one aloud, her voice thick with emotion. The children didn't cry, but something in their eyes changed. A hardness softened, a tension eased. They weren't just abandoned anymore. They were chosen, even if it was only on paper. As she finished, Eli handed her the last, smallest scrap. It was burned almost beyond recognition, but 3 words remained. "Don't give up." She clutched the scrap to her chest. It wasn't a memory. It was a command. That night, she didn't pack the letters away. She tacked them to the inside of her tent, a collage of broken promises that somehow felt more real than any vow. They fluttered in the draft like the wings of captured birds. The next evening, the children came with the smallest, Jonah, bundled in Eli's coat. His tiny hands clung to her skirt. "I want a letter, too," he whispered. Eliza knelt down in the snow, her heart aching. "A letter just for you?" He nodded, his eyes wide. She tore a scrap from her journal and wrote, "Dear Jonah, you are seen. You are held. Even when the world is cold, you are not alone. Love, Mama Eliza." He stared at the last words, tasting them. Mama Eliza. He clutched the paper like it was solid gold. That started a new tradition. Each night, a child would ask for a letter. Not for a toy or for food, but for words. A piece of paper that said they mattered. She wrote everyone and placed them in the mailbox on the tree. Soon, she started finding things in return. A crudely drawn picture of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. A smooth gray stone from the creek. A single feather. They were building something here, word by word, gift by gift. She was their letter mama. The town began to notice. The widow Prindle walked by one afternoon, leaving a jar of beets and a wool scarf on a stump. "Looks like you're building something real up here," she said, her eyes kind. But not everyone was kind. 2 nights later, the children arrived late, their faces pale and their clothes damp. Rose had a split lip. Eli's knuckles were bleeding. "She found the letters," June whispered, her voice trembling. "Martha, she said they're poison. She said you're poison." Eliza's stomach clenched. "Did she hurt you?" Eli shook his head, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "She said if we came back again, she'd send us away, to an orphanage. Said we don't belong to her and we sure as hell don't belong to you." Eliza didn't say a word. She just opened her arms, and they rushed into them, a tangle of limbs and quiet sobs. That night she hung something new on the mailbox. A small, tarnished bell that used to hang on her family's door in Boston. She tied it with a red ribbon and let it swing in the wind. It was a message, not just to the children, but to Martha, to the mountain, to the whole damn world. I'm here. We're here. And we're not leaving. The wind howled that night, and the snow piled high. But inside the tent, huddled together for warmth, she could hear it. A faint, clear ringing. A promise in the dark. The sound that woke her wasn't the wind. It was a scream, sharp, terrified, and cut short. Eliza threw her blankets off and scrambled out of the tent. Eli was hurtling down the snow-covered hill, his face a mask of panic. "She's gone!" he yelled, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Rose! She ran!" Eliza didn't waste a second. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her shawl, and followed him back up the treacherous path. The snow was deep, hiding the slick ice underneath. Their only guide was a set of small, frantic footprints leading away from the Bellamy house and into the dark woods. "Martha hit her!" Eli choked out between ragged breaths. "Caught her with a biscuit, accused her of stealing it for you, called you a witch, said you were poisoning us with your stories." A hot, white rage burned in Eliza's chest, melting the cold. They found Rose by the creek, curled into a tight ball beneath a fallen log, her thin dress soaked through. Her lips were blue. She was trembling violently, a tiny frozen bird. "Rose," Eliza whispered, kneeling beside her, brushing the snow and wet hair from her face. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." The girl didn't open her eyes, but she made a small sound and leaned into Eliza's touch as if it were the only warmth left in the world. Eli wrapped the girl in his own coat, and Eliza lifted her into her arms. She was terrifyingly light. "She was trying to get to you," Eli said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "That's all she wanted." Back at the tent, Eliza worked with a feverish intensity. She piled every blanket she owned onto the shivering girl. She boiled water and made a poultice of pine bark and herbs, pressing warm cloths to Rose's hands and feet. The other children had followed, their small faces pale with fear. They stood in the cramped tent, a silent, terrified audience. "Will she die?" Jonah whispered. "Not tonight," Eliza said, her voice fierce, a promise and a prayer. She sat with Rose all night, changing the compresses, humming lullabies she didn't know she remembered. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountain, Rose's trembling stopped. The color began to return to her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered. "She's coming back," June whispered in awe. Eliza just leaned down and pressed a kiss to the girl's forehead, finally letting her own tears fall, hot and silent, onto the child's hair. The next morning, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Sheriff Dunn, his face grim, frost clinging to his mustache. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his gun. He just stood there, his presence as heavy as the snow-laden pines. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, ma'am," he said, his voice low. Eliza stood up, placing herself between the sheriff and her tent full of children. "She was nearly frozen to death," Eliza said, her chin high. "She ran to me for help. I didn't take her. Martha Bellamy tells a different story. She's screaming kidnapping all over town. Says you're a menace, corrupting these children with fantasies." "Then ask them," Eliza shot back. The sheriff's eyes flickered past her to the small, watchful faces peeking through the tent flap. He sighed, a weary cloud of breath. "I'm not here to arrest anyone, not today, but the town is watching. Martha has a name here. You don't. You're not kin. You've got no claim." "I have their trust," Eliza said. He gave a single, slow nod. In this world, that's often not enough. He turned and walked away, his boots leaving deep, deliberate prints in the snow. That evening, as Rose sat propped up by the fire, weak but smiling, Ruth, the oldest girl, handed Eliza a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this," she said, "for you." Eliza unfolded it. "Dear letter, Mama, I think you saved her. Not just tonight. You saved all of us when you came. We might not be yours by law, but you're ours anyway, no matter what the sheriff says." She read it aloud, her voice catching. Ruth leaned her head against Eliza's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity that was stronger than any legal document. That night, they built a message. Eli found an old plank of wood. June borrowed a can of paint from the schoolhouse. Together, by the light of the fire, they painted a sign. The Letter House. They nailed it to the tree, right next to the mailbox and the little bell. It was a declaration. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a place. This was a home. The next morning, a fresh loaf of bread and a jar of blackberry jam sat on the stump by the path. There was no note, but Eliza knew what it meant. The town was choosing a side, and Martha knew it too. 2 days later, she appeared. She stood at the edge of the clearing, wrapped in a fur cloak, her face a mask of cold fury. "They are mine," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "Not yours." "They don't seem to think so," Eliza replied calmly, standing her ground. "They're children. You've confused them, filled their heads with pity and lies." "I've filled their hearts with something you never could," Eliza said. "Hope." Martha scoffed. "Hope doesn't fill a belly. Stories don't mend a ripped coat." "No," Eliza agreed, her voice dropping, becoming steel. "But they mend a broken spirit. And that's a hunger that will kill you faster than any winter." "I will see you gone from this mountain," Martha hissed. "Then you'll have to go through them first," Eliza said, gesturing to the silent line of children who had gathered behind her, a small, fierce, unmovable wall. Martha stared at them, her face twisting with rage and disbelief. Then she turned and stormed away, her cloak snapping behind her like a black flag of war. That night, the bell on the mailbox rang softly in the wind, a sound that was no longer a plea, but a promise. The next chapter was coming, and Eliza and her children would be ready. The first time she heard the preacher's voice, it came from behind her, quiet and unexpected. "You're the woman they call the Letter Mama." Eliza turned, a brush still tangled in June's hair. Pastor Alden stood there, a tall, severe man in a long black coat, his Bible tucked under his arm like a weapon. "I'm the woman they came to," she corrected him gently. His eyes swept over the clearing, taking in the patched tent, the smoking fire, the children who had fallen silent at his arrival. "I don't deal in gossip, ma'am. I deal in truth." "Then you've come to the right place," she said, turning back to June's hair. "These children have had enough lies to last them a lifetime." He didn't leave. Instead, he surprised her by crouching down in the snow beside Jonah, who was drawing patterns with a stick. "What's that you're making, son?" "A house," Jonah whispered. "It's got a door that don't lock." The preacher looked up at Eliza, and for the first time, the hardness in his eyes softened. "I came to see for myself," he admitted, standing up. "Sheriff Dunn says you've caused a great division. Martha Bellamy claims you've destroyed her family. But this—" He gestured around at the quiet domesticity, the feeling of safety that clung to the clearing like wood smoke. "This doesn't look like ruin." "What does it look like to you, Pastor?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "It looks like church," he said, and turned and walked away. He returned that evening, not with judgment, but with an armload of firewood and a pouch of dried apples. He didn't preach. He sat by the fire and listened. He listened as Eliza read one of the scorched letters. He listened as Ruth read a story she'd written herself about a family of stars who found a lost moon. He accepted a bowl of thin stew from June and ate it with quiet thanks. When he left, he pressed a folded paper into Eliza's hand. She opened it by the firelight. It was a copy of a letter Thomas Bellamy had written to the church council just before he married Martha. "If Eliza Whitmore arrives and I am gone or unable, I entrust my children to her care. She has no title, no land, but she has a heart, and that is what they will need more than anything." The ink was faded, but the words were a shield. A legal and moral claim forged by the very man who had betrayed her. She held the paper to her chest, feeling a shift deep inside her, a door creaking open. The next day, the town's quiet support became a steady stream. The blacksmith left a box of nails. A farmer left a sack of potatoes. Small offerings. Small acts of rebellion against Martha. Small votes of confidence in her. Peace, however, is a fragile thing. 3 days later, just before dusk, a horse rode into the clearing. It was Thomas. He looked like a ghost, thin and worn down, his eyes hollowed out. The children froze. Jonah scrambled behind Eliza's skirts. Ruth stepped forward, her small face set with defiance. "Thomas," Eliza said, her voice flat. "What do you want?" He dismounted, his movements slow, weary. "I came to see if it's true," he said, his voice cracking. "That they chose you." "You didn't need to ride all the way up here for that," she said coldly. "You could have just asked them a long time ago." His eyes found his children, pleading. They stared back, their faces closed, unreadable. Eli turned his back on his father and walked into the tent. The rejection was a physical blow. Thomas flinched. "I never meant—" "But you did," she cut him off. "You married another woman for her land and left your children to be hurt by her. You didn't protect them." "I didn't stop them from coming here," he offered weakly. "You didn't stop anything," she snapped. "That's always been your problem, Thomas. You just let things happen." He stood there, a broken man with nothing left to offer but excuses. "Why are you really here?" she asked. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn journal, the mate to the book of unsent letters. He opened it to the last page. His handwriting was shaky. "If she comes, and I've made a mess of things, let her stay. If she chooses to stay, let her raise them. And if they let her, for God's sake, don't get in her way." He held the journal out to her. It was a surrender, a confession, a blessing. She took it. "You can go now," she said. He looked at his children one last time, a desperate final appeal. None of them moved. He got back on his horse and rode away, disappearing into the twilight. That night, Ruth came to her as the fire burned low. "Can we call this home?" she asked, her voice thick with a hope she had never dared to speak aloud. Eliza looked at the patched canvas walls, the sleeping children, the letters tacked up like scripture. "Yes," she said, "I think it already is." But even as she spoke, she knew a new storm was gathering. A man's permission wasn't the same as the law's, and the world outside their small clearing was about to make itself known. The letter arrived sealed with the red wax stamp of the county court. Sheriff Dunn delivered it himself, his face grim. "It's a formal order," he said, handing her the stiff paper. "They're sending men. From the county seat. End of the week." Eliza didn't open it. She could feel the cold, bureaucratic words through the envelope. "They want to assess the situation," the sheriff continued, his voice low. "Determine if the children should be relocated to a proper facility. If your presence here is lawful." "And what do you think, Sheriff?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. He looked past her, at the small, sturdy sign that read, "The Letter House." "I think," he said slowly, "that I've seen more smiles up here in the last month than I saw in the last year. I think that matters more than any stamp on a piece of paper." But he was a lawman, and he had delivered the warning. The rest was up to her. Inside the tent, the news fell like a stone in a quiet pond. "They're coming to take us away," June whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "No," Eliza said, her voice full of a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "They are coming to hear our story, and we are going to tell them the truth, that this is a home, that we built it together." The next few days were a blur of anxious preparation. They didn't clean or scrub. They reinforced. Jonah gathered stones to make a stronger ring around the fire pit. Ruth painstakingly organized all the letters, Thomas's and their own, tying them in neat bundles with twine. It was an archive of their survival. On the last afternoon, Eliza gathered them at the base of an old, hollow oak tree. She gave each child a slip of paper. "Write it down," she told them. "Write down why you are here, what this place means to you." They wrote in silence, their small faces intent. She collected the notes, unread, placed them in an old tin box, and tucked it deep into the hollow of the tree. "Why are we hiding them?" Eli asked. "Because," she said, "if they try to tell us that what we built here isn't real, we'll have proof." Friday arrived with a biting wind and a sky the color of slate. The two men from the county wore city coats and expressions of stern disapproval. Their boots crunched on the frozen path like the footsteps of doom. "We're here for Eliza Whitmore," the taller one announced. "You found her," Eliza said, stepping forward, the children a silent phalanx behind her. The second man, broader and sterner, surveyed the camp. "And these are the Bellamy children." "These are the children who live here," she corrected. His jaw tightened. "We'll need to speak with them, separately." "We speak together," Eli said, his voice clear and strong. The man frowned. "That is not the procedure." "Then today," Eliza said, crossing her arms, "the procedure changes?" They questioned Ruth first. She sat on a stump, her back straight, and answered their questions with a calm dignity that unnerved them. "She feeds us," Ruth said. "She teaches us to read. When I cry at night, she doesn't pretend she can't hear me." "And your father?" "My father left. Twice." They moved on to the others, but their questions were met with the same unshakable loyalty. When they got to Jonah, he simply handed them the letter she had written for him. The men read it, their faces flushing with a strange discomfort, as if confronted with an emotion they had no form for. Finally, they turned to Eliza. "You have no legal standing here, Ms. Whitmore," the broad man said, his voice heavy with finality. "No marriage certificate, no deed to this land." She held up Thomas's journal. "I have his last will and testament." They skimmed the last page, unimpressed. He was an emotional man, not a judge. He was their father, she shot back. And he chose me. But more importantly, they do. She looked at her children, each one standing tall, their small faces a testament to a love stronger than any law. The men looked at each other. They had come expecting to find a squatter and neglected orphans. They had found a family. "We will take this back for review," the tall man said stiffly. They turned to leave, their mission incomplete, their authority challenged. But before they could retreat, Ruth stepped into their path. "You forgot something," she said. She pointed to the mailbox. "Your answer." She held out a sealed envelope. Inside was the letter she had written for the tin box, retrieved from the hollow tree that morning, a declaration she had decided should not be hidden. The men took it, confused and unsettled, and retreated down the hill. That night, the letter house was quiet, a deep, waiting quiet. Eliza didn't know what the law would decide, but as she sat by the fire, she reached into the mailbox and found a new drawing from Jonah. It was a picture of a stick-figure family with her in the middle and all of them holding hands. No judge, no county, no law could ever erase that. Days turned into a week, and the county remained silent. The trail to the letter house stayed empty. No riders, no official papers. The children's anxious questions slowly faded, replaced by the rhythm of their new life. They didn't just survive the waiting, they thrived in it. Eli built a lean-to for the growing stack of firewood. Ruth started a small garden plot, turning over the cold earth in anticipation of spring. They were no longer just holding on. They were putting down roots. One morning, a new figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. A girl no older than 16, barefoot despite the lingering chill. She clutched a threadbare blanket around her shoulders, and in her arms, she held a baby. She just stood there, shaking, her eyes wide with a desperate, hunted look. It was June who saw her first. "She's like us," she whispered to Eliza. Eliza walked out to meet her. The girl was starving, terrified, and on the verge of collapse. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "You're not late," Eliza said, putting an arm around her thin shoulders. "You're right on time." Her name was Hannah, and the baby was Caleb. She had walked for 2 days, following rumors of a place on the mountain, a house made of letters where they didn't turn you away. "I ran," she told Eliza late one night after the children were asleep. "From a man who said the baby was a mistake. From a family that called me a shame. I heard people talking in town. They said, 'Go to the woman on the ridge. She doesn't ask what you've done. She just asks if you're hungry.'" The letter house had become a story, a legend. And now the legend was drawing the lost and the broken to its door. Hannah's arrival changed something. The town's support, once quiet offerings of food, became more substantial. A local carpenter dropped off a load of scrap lumber. "Looks like you'll be needing another room come spring," he said with a wink. The preacher's wife sent a box of quilt squares. The sheriff himself brought by a large, sturdy kettle he'd found. It wasn't charity. It was investment. They were helping to build not just a shelter, but an institution. One afternoon, Ruth gathered everyone. "We're not calling it a tent anymore," she announced with solemn importance. "It's the house now. Just the house." So that's what it became. The house. That night, a storm rolled in, throwing wind and snow against the canvas and the new wooden walls. But inside, the fire burned bright, the children slept soundly, and the walls held. In the morning, the world was washed clean, glistening under a bright sun, and Eliza heard the bell on the mailbox ring, not with the wind, but with the firm pull of a human hand. A man stood on the path. He was tall, weathered, with kind, tired eyes and a satchel slung over his shoulder. He looked strangely familiar. "I'm looking for the letter house," he said. Eli stepped forward, a boy now standing on the cusp of being a man. "You found it." The stranger's gaze went past him, to Eliza standing in the doorway, her family arrayed behind her like a shield. A look of profound relief washed over his face. "My name is Warren," he said. "I'm Thomas Bellamy's brother." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The past wasn't done with them yet. It had just walked right up to their door. Warren Bellamy took off his hat, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "We hadn't spoken in years," he said, his voice rough. Then a letter came. Months ago. Thomas wrote that he was sick, dying. Said he'd sent for a woman from the East. A woman he hoped was strong enough to do what he couldn't. He looked at the children, his nieces and nephews, with a sense of wonder. "He sent me this," Warren said, pulling a second identical journal from his satchel. "He kept copies of everything. The last page. That's what made me come." He handed the book to Eliza. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Thomas's familiar script filled the final page. "If you're reading this, Warren, it means she came. It means she stayed. Give her what I couldn't. Give her the right to call them hers. The deed is in the safe. The key is with this book. Make it right." Eliza looked up from the page, her heart a wild drum in her chest. Warren reached into his pocket and produced a small, ornate brass key. "It's for the safe under the floorboards in the old house," he said. "The deed to this land is inside. It's not much, but it's a start. It's his signature. It's his intent." It was everything. It was the foundation they had been missing, the paper and ink to make their house of hope into a fortress. That night, Warren sat by their fire, and Jonah fell asleep in his lap. He had come to settle a debt and found a family he didn't know he had. The snows melted. The garden Ruth had planted began to sprout. Warren stayed, helping Eli reinforce the walls, teaching the boys how to track, becoming the gentle, steady male presence the house had so desperately needed. Then, one sunny afternoon, the sheriff rode up again. He wasn't grim this time. He was smiling. He handed Eliza an official-looking document, the county seal stamped in blue, not red. She unfolded it. It was a statement of guardianship, signed by a judge, naming Eliza Whitmore as the legal caretaker of the Bellamy children, and any others who found sanctuary under her roof. Attached was the deed to the land, officially transferred. By choice, not blood. She sat down on the steps of her house, the paper trembling in her hands, and she wept. Not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of relief so profound they felt like they were washing away years of struggle. The house grew. Another room was added, then a real porch with a swing. The mailbox stayed, a beacon on its tree, often filled with letters from strangers who had heard the story and just needed to tell someone their own. They never turned anyone away. Years passed. The letter house on Summit Ridge became more than a local legend. It was a destination, a safe harbor, a place people whispered about in train stations and dark alleys. "Go to the woman on the ridge," they'd say. "She'll give you a bowl of stew and a place to rest. She doesn't care where you've been, only where you're going." Eliza grew old, her hair turning the color of the winter snow, but her spirit never faded. She still read stories by the fire each night, her voice a comforting rasp, surrounded by a constantly changing, ever-growing family of souls who had been lost and then found. One autumn evening she sat on the porch swing, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The porch was lined with shoes of all sizes, boots, sandals, small children's slippers, a testament to all the journeys that had ended and begun right here. She had come to Summit Ridge for a promise made by one man, a promise that was broken before she even arrived. But in its place, she had built a new promise, a bigger one, a promise to every lost soul that there was always a light on, always a warm fire, and always a place you could call home. If you believe a home is built from love, not just lumber, and that kindness can change the world, don't forget to like and subscribe. You never know when you might need to find your own letter house.